More and more people are getting interested in preserving foods using fermentation, and sauerkraut is a classic fermented dish that's easy for beginners to make in their own kitchens.
Working on a rhythm. Working on a rhythm. Working on a rhythm. Working on a rhythm.
This is Dan Kibler, a certified organic market gardener from Ashland, Missouri, who has been a very active leader in the Missouri farmers market and local food community for the past 23 years. Dan grows and sells his produce mainly at the Columbia Farmers Market, area restaurants, and a small CSA. Recently, Dan became fascinated by the health benefits of fermenting organic vegetables and is revisiting his German, Swiss, and French heritage and his childhood in Hermann, Missouri, by handcrafting naturally fermented sauerkraut, just as his ancestors did.
Yeah, so we're going to make sauerkraut today, and we're going to make it so that it can be done in the kitchen for just 1 quart at a time, okay? And so that anyone can do it, and it's a very easy process.
Dan, a certified organic grower, is using a 4-pound cabbage, but all we'll need to fill a quart jar is 2 to 3 pounds. Using an organically grown cabbage, rinse off the dirt and remove any damaged leaves. Cut the cabbage in half, then again into quarters, using a large knife. Remove the core from the quarters. After coring, it's time to shred the cabbage. For home use, you could just use a big sharp knife and slice the cabbage into thin vertical strips. You could also use a mandolin, and Dan has an industrial-sized mandolin that's been in his family for many years. He recently dug it out of a closet in his parents' home and got the blade sharpened, and now he uses it to make big batches of sauerkraut. You can use your regular-sized mandolin or shred the cabbage by hand. A food processor is not recommended. You need to get a large container to catch the cabbage if you use a mandolin. Shred the cabbage using your mandolin's handguard when you get close to the blade to avoid cutting your hands or fingers. Cut any remaining pieces of cabbage by hand. Dan says that there is a ratio of salt to cabbage that must be followed. He weighs a wedge to find out that each one weighs about a pound, so shredding 2 wedges is just about right. The formula is to use 2.5 tablespoons of salt for every 5 pounds of cabbage. Dan explains that all that's needed to make sauerkraut is cabbage, salt, and the third ingredient that's already in there, bacteria. Although too much salt is unpalatable, too little salt may be dangerous since the salt keeps the bad bacteria in check. So Dan's tried to come up with a formula that's just right. Now the work begins. The salt must be worked into the cabbage to break down the cells. First, Dan mixes everything together, then he begins to actually crunch the cabbage in his hands, which breaks down the cells and squeezes the moisture out of the cabbage. This process will create enough juice to submerge the cabbage in the jar, and as long as there are no air pockets in the jar and the cabbage is fully submerged in the liquid, an anaerobic environment is created for the fermentation. The cabbage gets smaller and smaller as Dan continues to crush and wring it with his hands until it's greatly reduced, which takes about 90 seconds. Using a clean, wide-mouthed jar and a wide-mouthed funnel, we partially fill the jar with the cabbage. Using a tool of his own design, we tamp the cabbage down in the jar until the foamy liquid rises to the top. Dan uses a modified PVC pipe designed by a friend for this process. Keep adding cabbage and tamping it down in stages until the jar is filled to about 1.5 inches from the top. We ended up having enough left over to fill a pint jar too. We place a medium-sized apple in the jar and push it into the sauerkraut until the liquid rises up and starts to spill over. The apple is there to hold the cabbage down and keep it fully submerged in the liquid. Now your work is done. Simply place the jar on a plate or dish on your counter and leave it to ferment for the next few weeks, checking now and then to make sure everything is still submerged. If you see foam, you can skim it out, and if any cabbage is not submerged, just discard those pieces. Allow the kraut to ferment in an air-conditioned room for 3 to 4 weeks. The process of fermentation is generally finished after 4 weeks, so at that point you can discard the apple, tightly seal the jar, and keep it in your refrigerator for 6 months to a year.
Working on a rhythm. Working on a rhythm. Working on a rhythm.